Samuel Carter, a black World War II veteran, becomes a target of a racist attack by a police officer, unaware that his police captain is watching. This incident marks only the beginning of a series of events that will plunge Samuel into a world of brutal injustice and racism. What happens next will shock even the most seasoned among us. But before we begin, like and subscribe to the channel. Your support will help bring attention to this video and provide encouragement to those facing racism to continue the fight. Your contribution is crucial for change. Early one morning in Oakwood Park, Samuel Carter, a 92-year-old black World War II veteran, sat on his favorite bench by the pond. His face and worn military jacket bore the traces of a long life. Samuel had survived wars, hardships, and loss, but had maintained his dignity despite loneliness and homelessness. The park had become his refuge, where he could find peace and remember his fallen comrades. To many, he was just an old man. But for Samuel, this place was his last haven of calm in a chaotic world. At the other end of the park, a young officer named Ryan abruptly stopped when he noticed Samuel. His instincts kicked in, not those formed by experience, but by prejudice and haste to make judgments. Ryan was full of ambition, seeing himself as a guardian of order in a city where people like Samuel were, in his opinion, the source of problems. He had only been on the job for a few months, but that time was enough for him to become overly confident and quick to judge people based on appearances. Ryan squinted, sizing up Samuel, and everything inside him tensed up. "What's that old man doing here?" he thought. In his mind, the image quickly formed. Homeless, black, elderly. He must be a troublemaker. Ryan decided that this man had no right to be there, sitting on that bench, especially in such a respectable part of the park. Ryan had long convinced himself that it was his duty to maintain order, and people like Samuel needed to be removed from the peaceful corners of the city. Without hesitation, the officer walked briskly toward the elderly man. His boots echoed on the path, and his face became more serious and stern. Inside, his irritation grew, not at Samuel as a person, but at the very fact of his presence in this place. Ryan felt superior to people like this veteran, whom he believed didn't belong in society. When Ryan approached the bench, his voice was sharp and authoritative. "Hey, old man, you can't sit here," he barked, barely stopping in front of Samuel. To Ryan, this was a routine situation. He was already used to bossing people around, especially those he considered beneath him. Samuel slowly raised his head. He had long stopped being surprised by such treatment. It had become part of his daily life. But instead of fear or submission, his eyes held a calm and steady gaze, the look of a man who had faced far greater challenges than this young officer could ever imagine. "I'm just resting, officer. Is there something wrong with that?" His voice was low but confident, filled with the inner strength that had endured through years of hardship. But Ryan wasn't listening. To him, this old man was not a person, but a problem that needed solving as quickly as possible. He saw Samuel as a source of trouble, and was determined to remove him. In Derek's eyes, Samuel was just another offender, and he wasn't about to waste time explaining or trying to understand the situation. Neither Samuel nor Derek knew that someone else was watching their conversation intently. Captain James, a veteran officer with over 2 decades of service, happened to be in the park by chance. It was a typical morning, and he had decided to take a walk through the quiet streets as part of his routine district check. Usually, his work was confined to running the precinct and dealing with paperwork. But from time to time, he liked to go out on patrol to stay connected with real-life situations on the streets. Stopping behind some thick trees, James froze and began to observe. He knew he couldn't intervene immediately. He needed to assess the whole picture, and what he saw made him internally tense. Samuel Carter, a man whose face and name he had heard of, sat before Ryan. The old man looked calm despite his age and likely a hard life. But Ryan, he was a different story. His behavior was becoming increasingly aggressive and authoritarian. The young patrolman seemed unaware of whom he was dealing with. To him, Samuel was just another homeless person who needed to be removed from the park. Captain James, watching this, couldn't help but recall his own early years on the force. He too had been young, too hot-headed, and sometimes overly confident. But years of experience had taught him an important lesson. Authority not only gives you the right to act, but also the responsibility to protect those you serve. He knew that Ryan had yet to grasp this balance and was now abusing his authority. And while such situations were not uncommon among young officers, something about this particular incident stirred a deep sense of injustice within James. Maybe it was the way Samuel, despite his advanced age and obvious hardships, maintained his calm and dignity in the face of aggression. James felt something personal in this scene. Perhaps it reminded him of his own mistakes in the past when he, as a young officer, had made wrong decisions. Or maybe it was simply a human reaction to the blatant injustice he couldn't ignore. Captain James knew he had to step in, but he also understood he needed to choose the right moment. He continued to monitor Derek's every word and movement, ready to step out of the shadows and take control of the situation at any moment. Officer Derek stared at Samuel, feeling his irritation growing. He didn't like that this old man, instead of complying, remained completely unfazed. Samuel sat upright, with a dignity that seemed excessive to Ryan for someone he considered merely homeless. There was no fear or submission in Samuel's eyes, which only angered Ryan further. The young patrolman wasn't prepared for this kind of resistance. Silent but firm, Ryan defiantly touched his baton, as if hinting that he was ready to use force. But Samuel, having survived wars and hardships, wasn't about to give in. His calmness was not a sign of weakness, but the result of many years of fighting life's battles. He was a soldier, and the resilience forged through years of service didn't allow him to yield to the threats of a young officer. Samuel looked directly at Ryan, his eyes remaining steady, his body motionless, as if he was silently saying, "You won't intimidate me." He saw in the officer youth an inexperience, which only strengthened his internal confidence. Samuel responded quietly but firmly, "This bench is public." He knew he had every right to sit there. His words were spoken as fact, beyond question, as if there was no doubt about his rightness. There was no aggression in his voice, only the certainty that he had done nothing wrong. Samuel understood that he had faced similar situations many times before, and it had become almost routine for him. Although outwardly Samuel remained calm, inside he was enveloped by a familiar sense of injustice. He had often faced prejudice because of his skin color, even after all his contributions to the country. As a war veteran, he had fought for his country's freedom, only to return home to battle a different, no less cruel reality: discrimination. Each time, this feeling of injustice echoed dully in his chest, but over the years, he had learned not to show his emotions. This situation was just one of many he had encountered in his life. While Ryan and Samuel exchanged words, a small crowd began to gather around. Passers-by slowed down, stopped, sensing something was happening. They watched the scene, unsure what to expect. Some observed with concern at the growing tension, while others were simply curious. People began whispering among themselves, wondering why the officer was being so aggressive and what it would lead to. As Ryan, irritated by Samuel's defiance, reached for his handcuffs, ready to force the elderly man to comply, the air in the park seemed to thicken. Everything was happening quickly, but it felt as if time had slowed down for a moment. In this tense instant, a loud, confident voice rang out from behind. "Officer Derek, stand down." Derek froze, his hand hovering over the handcuffs. He quickly turned, his heart skipping a beat. Standing before him was Captain James, a man with an impressive service record and a reputation as an officer who wouldn't tolerate injustice. His figure, suddenly appearing among the trees, seemed even more imposing against the backdrop of the morning light. The crowd that had gathered around immediately took notice of the captain's arrival, sensing that the situation was about to change dramatically. James quickly approached, his face expressing seriousness and determination. He wouldn't allow this incident to escalate any further. Stopping between Ryan and Samuel, he firmly stood in front of the young patrolman, like a wall between two worlds, the world of authority and the world of experience and dignity. "This man has done nothing wrong," the captain said firmly, his voice commanding like an order. His gaze held ironclad certainty, and he wasn't about to tolerate excuses. James knew that not every patrolman could grasp the nuances of such situations, but that didn't excuse the excessive aggression Ryan had shown. Samuel was a veteran, a man who deserved respect, not this kind of treatment. Ryan tried to justify himself, his face flushed with surprise and confusion. "Captain, but he began, but James immediately cut him off, unwilling to listen to any excuses. "You know full well that he hasn't broken any rules." "No, but I'm not discussing this." His voice was cold and unwavering. It was the voice of a man who had already made up his mind and wasn't going to back down. The crowd watched the scene in silence, both surprised and relieved by the captain's intervention. The tension gradually dissipated, but there remained a sharp awareness of how close this incident had come to injustice. Captain James, ensuring that the tense situation with Ryan was resolved, turned to Samuel with a different expression on his face. The harshness with which he had spoken to the young patrolman instantly softened into warmth and empathy. He understood that he wasn't just looking at an old man, but at a veteran who had likely seen and endured far more than many could imagine. The captain's voice became gentle, almost apologetic. "Sir, I apologize for how you were treated. No one should have to endure that," James said, his words filled with respect and sincere regret. Samuel, sensing that the captain was sincere, slowly nodded, his gaze focused on James's face. There was no anger or resentment in Samuel's eyes, only weariness and resignation to what had become all too familiar for him. He had been through such moments dozens of times, but each one left a mark on his soul. The veteran looked at the captain with understanding and quietly replied, "I've seen a lot, Captain, but thank you." His voice carried the wisdom of a man long accustomed to injustice and who had learned to face it with dignity. James, being a veteran himself, deeply understood what lay behind Samuel's words. He knew that people who had gone through wars often face a new kind of battle, a fight for survival and recognition on their home soil. For James, this moment wasn't just a matter of fulfilling his duty. It was a matter of honor. He couldn't allow a man who had given his life and health for his country to suffer from such situations. Without further words, Captain James reached into his uniform pocket and pulled out a business card. This card was a small but significant symbol of the assistance he provided to veterans. Handing it to Samuel, the captain said with warm confidence, "There's a veterans shelter nearby. Tell them Captain James sent you. They'll help you." James knew that this shelter truly offered support. A warm bed, hot meals, and a chance to recover after years of struggling on the streets. Samuel carefully took the card, looking at it intently, as if he was holding something more than just a piece of paper. He knew that behind this gesture lay genuine understanding and support. Samuel looked at James again, and for a moment, sincere gratitude flickered in his eyes. Although Samuel rarely accepted help, he felt that this offer was not just a formality. Captain James truly wanted to help. "Thank you," Samuel quietly said, nodding. His eyes softened for a moment, and although years of living on the streets had taught him caution, in this moment he allowed himself to believe that there were still people willing to support him. Captain James, having finished his conversation with Samuel, slowly turned to Ryan. His face, which had softened during the conversation with the veteran, once again became stern. The captain's eyes were cold, and his voice carried a weight no one would dare ignore. "Ryan, I expect you in my office tomorrow morning. We need to discuss your future in this precinct," he said firmly and clearly, making it known that this issue couldn't be postponed. For Ryan, these words hit like thunder out of a clear sky. The young officer's face turned pale, and he felt a cold fear grip his chest. He knew what this meant. Captain James's reputation was well known throughout the department. Strict, principled, and unforgiving to those who abused their power or acted improperly, especially when it came to racism or discrimination. James wasn't just a leader. He was a symbol of justice, and every officer knew that there would be no compromises with him. At that moment, standing before the captain, Derek felt the full weight of his actions. He realized that what had seemed to him like a routine check and an assertion of authority would have serious consequences. In James's eyes, there was no hint that this incident could be smoothed over or dismissed as a minor misunderstanding. No, James had already made up his mind. The question of whether Ryan would remain in this precinct was directly tied to his behavior today. The young officer tried to collect his thoughts, searching for explanations or excuses, but it was useless. He knew that such excuses wouldn't work with the captain. James was known for always demanding full accountability for his subordinates' actions. He couldn't stand those who abused their power, and Ryan understood that his career could very well end here. The crowd around, sensing the shift in atmosphere, watched this scene with silent tension. Many knew Captain James, and were confident that he would do the right thing. People were already whispering among themselves, speculating on what would happen next. Some of the bystanders understood that the fate of not only one patrolman was being decided, but also the way the police department would be perceived in this city. With his intervention and decisive actions, James had shown that injustice would not go unnoticed. Ryan, realizing the seriousness of the situation, tried to gather himself, but his voice betrayed him, trembling. "Captain, I just—" "No, but, Ryan," James interrupted him. "You knew what you were doing, and you made a choice. Tomorrow, we'll discuss this in detail. You'll have a chance to explain yourself, but you must understand that I won't tolerate this behavior in my precinct." These words left no room for doubt. Ryan understood that his chances of continuing to serve in this department depended on the following day, and that day would be one of the most difficult in his life. When Captain James turned away from Ryan and began to walk away, Samuel, who had silently observed the unfolding events, suddenly rose from his bench. Despite his age and the pain in his joints, he quickly walked over to the captain. His face didn't show anger or resentment, but deep thought and inner strength. He caught up to James and placed a hand on his shoulder, stopping him. The captain turned, slightly surprised to see Samuel. The veteran paused for a moment, as if weighing his words, and then spoke with a soft yet firm tone. "Captain, wait. I want to ask you to give this young man a chance." James frowned, clearly not expecting such a turn of events. "Sir," this officer behaved inappropriately. "He abused his authority, and there must be consequences." Samuel shook his head. "I know, Captain. I've seen a lot in my life. But each of us makes mistakes sometimes. This young man doesn't yet fully understand what it means to have real responsibility. But I believe that people can learn and change. I ask you to keep him if he apologizes and promises not to act like this again." Marshall was struck by the nobility of Samuel's words. He knew that most people in such a situation wouldn't just stand up for their offender. They would demand fair punishment. But here stood a man who, despite all the injustices, was showing remarkable magnanimity. Samuel wasn't just asking for forgiveness for Ryan. He was offering him the chance to change. James looked at Ryan, who was standing nearby with his head lowered, realizing the seriousness of what was happening. "Ryan," the captain called. "Come here." The young officer approached, visibly embarrassed. His face was pale, and his expression was one of guilt. "Samuel is asking to give you a second chance," James said, indicating the veteran. "Do you understand how generous that is?" Ryan raised his eyes and looked at Samuel, astonished by his actions. I sincerely apologize," he said quietly. "I was wrong. I shouldn't have treated you like that." His voice trembled, but there was sincere remorse in it. He understood that he had done wrong, and hadn't expected Samuel to stand up for him. Samuel looked at the young patrolman carefully and nodded. "Everyone makes mistakes, but what's important is to learn from them. Just remember, people deserve respect, regardless of their status." James, satisfied that Ryan had recognized his mistake, sighed and nodded to Samuel in a gesture of respect. "All right, Ryan," the captain finally said. "You're getting a second chance, but remember, there won't be a third." Ryan nodded, taking a deep breath. "Thank you, Captain." "Thank you, sir," he added, addressing Samuel. At that moment, he realized he had not only been given a chance to keep his job, but also an opportunity to become a better person. Samuel had shown a level of grace that Ryan had yet to achieve, and this became a crucial lesson for him. James, looking at Samuel with respect, said, "You've done more than many would in your place. Your words today will change this young man." Samuel smiled. "Sometimes you just have to give a person a chance."